During the Napoleonic Wars, Britain found out that Tsar Paul I of Russia planned to invade British India while he was allied with France. But Paul was assassinated before the Indian March of Paul could really get underway, but for the next century, anti-Russian sentiment was prevalent in Britain. At that time, Britain only held parts of India, but by the 1820s most of it was under British rule. And Russia, after the Napoleonic Wars, began to colonize the steppes of Kazakhstan, and by 1828 they had taken the Caucasus from Persia. In the middle of these two empires lay a number of Indian states: Persia, Afghanistan, Bukhara, Kokand, Khiva, and many Turkmen tribes. And many of the Central Asian states had been enslaving Russians for centuries, but Russia became more focused with the declining Ottoman Empire, or the Eastern Question. Although Russia annexed Ottoman land in 1829, they were able to gain influence over them in the 1830s by agreeing to help them push back the armies of Muhammad Ali of Egypt. So British diplomats rushed to gain influence in Central Asia, but some of them were killed for espionage. Plus, Russia was able to gain another ally, Persia, in exchange for helping them reclaim Herat from Afghanistan in 1838. The British, however, got involved and forced Persia to withdraw, but Emir Dost Muhammad of Afghanistan still didn't align himself with Britain because they were unwilling to help him reclaim land lost to the Sikh Empire. So fearing he would align himself with Russia, British India invaded Afghanistan in 1839. But the First Afghan War was a disaster and had very little support from London, so they withdrew. Meanwhile, the small Russian Kievan expedition to free slaves in 1839 also failed. So Britain, looking to end the possibility of a future expedition, successfully negotiated for the slaves to be released. In the 1840s, Britain expanded in India, but the declining Ottoman Empire dominated politics once again. The London Straits Convention of 1841 pulled the Ottomans away from Russian influence, and the tensions would result in the Crimean War a decade later. But in Asia, regions like Badakhshan and Wakhan broke away from Afghanistan, and Britain again had to stop the Persians from taking Herat in 1856. This time, however, a weakened Dost Muhammad signed an alliance with Britain. The Russians, on the other hand, were weakened after the Crimean War and were dealing with uprisings in Kazakhstan and the Caucasus, while Britain had to subdue the Sepoy Mutiny in India in 1857, and both took land from the Chinese after the Opium Wars. So very little changed in Central Asia until Russian General Chernayev, acting without authorization, took a small army to capture Chimkent in 1864. From there, the Russians were easily able to vassalize Bukhara and Kokand by 1868. The two powers quickly entered negotiations, and in 1873 Badakhshan and Wakhan were recognized as part of British-influenced Afghanistan, while Russia was free to vassalize Khiva. Russia was then busy with the Dungan revolt in China and a war with the Ottomans. But when peace was made in 1878, they sent an envoy to Sher Ali Khan of Afghanistan. The British sent their own envoy afterwards, but it was rejected, so they invaded and made Afghanistan a puppet during the Second Afghan War. Nevertheless, the Russians were still able to expand by conquering the Turkmen tribes in 1881 and by signing a border treaty with Persia. But the Russians attacked the Afghan fort of Panjshir, claiming it was inhabited by a Turkmen tribe that had submitted to them. The Delimitation Protocol of 1885 and another one in 1893 managed to keep the peace and settle Afghanistan's northern borders. While over in Europe, Russia began to strengthen their alliance with France after their alliance with Germany had broken down, but anti-Russian sentiment in Britain led them to form an alliance with Japan in 1902, and they very nearly ended the Russo-Japanese War against Russia. But the governors of India began to worry about Russian influence in Tibet. Chinese rule had diminished in the region, and a Russian Buddhist, Akhvan Dorjiev, was close with the 13th Dalai Lama. So Viceroy George Curzon entered Tibet and captured Lhasa in 1904. But they soon agreed to recognize Chinese control over Tibet because Germany was now seen as the greater threat than Russia, especially after Russia's defeat to Japan. Britain made an alliance with France in 1904, and a rebellion in Persia finally repaired Anglo-Russian relations. The Shah was forced to create a constitution and a parliament, so the two empires, disliking the new government, agreed to divide Persia into spheres of influence. So by the outbreak of World War I, the two had settled their differences, but the Russian Revolution changed all that. The British joined the war against the Bolsheviks, and there were small unsuccessful missions in Central Asia. Plus, in 1919, Amunullah Khan of Afghanistan attacked British India, starting the Third Anglo-Afghan War, which guaranteed Afghanistan's independence. And the Bolsheviks planned to stir up the already growing anti-British sentiment in South Asia and invade. But the Kalmyk project, as it was called, never got underway. Instead, the Bolsheviks were forced to fight the Basmachi movement in Central Asia until the 1930s and redraw the borders numerous times. The two nations united to invade Persia during World War II, but Britain's hold over India continued to deteriorate and they withdrew from South Asia after the war.